Welcome back to the first session. Inaugural is already being done, and now it is technically the first session of our 7 days international integrated management learning and development program. So it's very wonderful to see you, such an engaging audience as well. The experience we had in the inaugural session, everybody was using the chat box. So here also we expect the same. And today we have two distinguished speakers along with us to explore or to guide us further. We have Dr. Juhi Gupta and Professor Andrew Davies. Before introducing both of them, I would like to give a small instruction as we did in the inaugural as well. Those who have joined now, please use the chat box for all the conversations. Question and answers session would be taken in the last 15 minutes. But in between the session, if you have any questions, please mention that in the chat box. At the end, after completing the session, both of our eminent speakers will address those questions. I hope that is fine with everyone. Let's begin by first introducing our resource person, Professor Andrew Davies. He is a biblical scholar and a leading authority in public religion from the University of Birmingham. Professor Davies founded and directed the Edward Cadbury Center for the Public Understanding of Religion. His extensive research focuses on the impact of sacred texts and religious beliefs on policy, politics, culture, and society. He has spearheaded significant projects like AHRC funded mega churches and social engagement in London. His collaborative efforts with UK government departments are pivotal in enhancing the understanding of religion in policy making. Professor Davies also oversees the Master of Public Administration in Faith-Based Leadership and MA in Religion, Politics, and Society programs at his university. His insights today are especially relevant to the themes of our program. Moving to the next esteemed resource person, Dr. Juhi Gupta. She is an assistant professor at Advanced Center for Women Studies at Aligarh Muslim University. Dr. Gupta's academic journey led her to do a PhD from Jamia Millia Islamia, focusing on the topic of her PhD was influence of fatwas and feminist consciousness among Muslim women. Specializing in gender issues, women's rights, and the challenges faced by the marginalized communities, Dr. Gupta has organized numerous initiatives on gender sensitization and women's issues. She is actively involved in several significant roles, including as a nodal officer for the MHRD's gender campaign scheme, and her publications and editorial contributions and books offer profound insights into her dialogues on ethical leadership. So as a part of our MLDP today's session is designed to explore the intersections of ethical leadership with diverse societal sectors. So with no further delay, let's welcome both of them to share their perspectives and engage us in a vital conversation. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome. Over to you, Professor Andrew and Dr. Juhi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shaminji, for such a warm welcome. And Sabi ko namaskar, haman amantrit karani ke liye dhanyavad. Mera naam Andrew hai. England aaj ka mausam bahut dhoop aur garmi hai. And that's the limit of my Hindi, I'm afraid. So I'll have to revert to English for the rest of the session, but it's a real joy to be with you today. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm delighted to be sharing the platform with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Juhi. So Juhi, please do say hello.
Yeah, hello everyone. It's an honor to interact with all of you, and as we've been introduced by Dr. Shamin. So yeah, so I teach at Aligarh Muslim University, and Andrew and me have been working on this area, value-based leadership, for a couple of years. So it's an honor and a privilege to share our insights with you, to get engaged into a meaningful discussion together on this issue, and also to explore pathways for fostering value-based leadership among us as academicians. So thank you very much for having us, and I look forward to having an insightful discussion ahead. Thank you. Over to you, Andrew. Let's start.
Thank you so much, Juhi. Yeah, we're grateful for your insights and your feedback, and we'll be very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say back to us at the end of the session. Hopefully, everybody can see the slides. Okay. So I want to talk about what it means to be a leader that people can look up to. My understanding of leadership is that leadership isn't about status, it's not about position, it's not about titles. We think of leadership as taking responsibility, exercising influence to deliver impact, using our God-given skills to change the world, not just for our own advantage, but for the good of society. And that's the kind of leadership that our world needs. It's really interesting if you look at any of the studies about leadership, they all kind of make that kind of claim that the world is desperate for leadership that has got some kind of solid anchor, that's got some kind of key ideological principle that motivates it and drives it forward. And across most of the Western world in particular, we really struggled in the last years with a lack of that kind of leadership. Too much of our leadership in the UK and in the West has been very much focused around exploitative behaviors, problematic ethical conduct and things like that. And so really what we're trying to do in leadership is to kind of push back against that and just say that actually our values are a great way of founding our leadership and inspiring our leadership. So what kind of leader do you want to be? What kind of leader should we all aspire to be? Well, I think the starting point maybe should be, who do we admire? Who do we look up to? What is it that inspires us about them? So if you would, just for a moment, I'm not going to ask you to feed back on this, but just think to yourself of the name of maybe one leader that you admire. Just have a think about why you admire them so much and how that leader has influenced your lives. There are lots of great reasons that you might have for admiring that leader. People sometimes say, well, it's the way that great leaders make you feel. It's the confidence and security that they create. It's the way that they support their team and lead their team forward. Maybe they showed real compassion and loyalty to you at a difficult time for you personally, or maybe they've done a good job of leading your organization, your university, your country. Leaders do a lot of things, but perhaps we admire them most when they do what they said they would do, when they allow their values to shape their actions. And there are many great leaders that I personally admire very much, but one of my favorite models, if you like, is Martin Luther King, who in the 1960s led the civil rights movement in the USA. And Martin Luther King said so many amazing things. This is one of my favorite quotes from him, though. He said, I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. This is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil, triumphant. Powerful words. But they were more than just words. That was an aspiration that was lived out in the things that he did. Many other things that he spoke about, like you perhaps heard his very famous I Have a Dream speech, where he said, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He sought to live by those values at any cost, even though ultimately they cost him his life. He clung to those values and was motivated by them throughout. And that's one reason why I find him so inspirational. Now, very few of us in this call here today have got global responsibilities of quite that level to carry, but all of us influence and shape the lives of those that we lead. So we need to do it well. We need for our values, and where applicable for our faith values, to shape our attitudes. So I want to ask you just for 30 seconds if you'd help me with a short activity. Again, we're not going to ask you to feed back on these. This is just for your personal edification and your personal reflection over the next few days. Take a moment to just think of 3 values that are really important to you as individuals. Maybe just make a note of those privately or store them in your mind. You don't need to share them with anyone. And as you are confronted with leadership decisions over the next few days and the next months to come, ask yourselves, does what I am deciding to do in here align with those values? How do those values that I've made a note of here, how do they help me as I'm confronting the leadership challenges that I'm trying to address this week and every week? That's a kind of starting point, really, in just helping you think about what it is to be a value-driven leader. And at that point, let me hand over to Juhi to take us through what ethical leadership looks like. Thanks, Juhi.
Thank you, Andrew. So yeah, so what is ethical leadership that we have been talking about? So we'll start with some famous sayings that we often hear, like doing the right thing for the right reason at the right time. I'm sure we have heard of this, or walking in line with the talk, or practicing what you preach, all those things. Or in Hindi, we would say, Jaisi kathni, vaisi karni. So what would that mean? What do we use these sayings in context with? So all these sayings, what they have in common is the alignment of beliefs, words, and deeds, which is central to establishing a reputation of honesty, integrity, and trustworthiness. So what do we expect from ethical leaders is that they would do what they promise to do. So when their behavior aligns with the beliefs they profess, their leadership is then more effectively embraced by those within their sphere of influence. Now, ethical leadership, but what are ethics? So if we go by definition, ethics is the term used to describe a personal set of beliefs about what is morally right or wrong. So when we use these ethics in professional settings, it describes rules, principles, standards for deciding what is morally right or wrong. Now, effective leaders demonstrate high ethical standards, and this is what we expect from them. These ethical standards are actually more than just the window dressing or just for display. They actually go by their words. Why ethical leadership is so important and why are we emphasizing on this? Because in past few years, we have seen a number of scandals involving ethical lapse of high-level leaders. So because of which there has been a lot of public attention on moral and ethical aspects of leadership. There has been a lack of public confidence in organizational leaders, and it has been observed that people's faith in leadership has declined over the years. And it was validated by several surveys and reports. For example, Ipsos Mori conducts an annual survey, which is called as Veracity Survey. It was found that over the years, in past 20 years, there has been a continuous decline in the trustworthiness among people in their leaders. Now, several reasons for this, all these scandals and all the reports which reported the ethical and moral malpractices in various organizations. And therefore, in recent years, there have been a lot of emphasis on people, on leaders adopting ethical practices. Because when the leaders adopt unethical practices and when their decision making is influenced by such decisions, the people in their team are also seen to be adopting to such practices. So this was one of the reasons there's been a lot of emphasis on ethical leadership, and therefore we are having this session. To understand ethical leaders better, we'll go by certain authors. So there's been an author, some authors, Slovenian authors, but they've done survey on the literature review of the global literature, and they've come up with some conclusion which was relevant to the global audience. And they say that ethical leaders think about long-term consequences, not just what is important at the moment, but long-term consequences, drawbacks, and benefits of their decisions that they make in the organization. Ethical leaders are humble, concerned for the greater good, strive for fairness, take responsibility, and show respect for each individual. And the findings of these authors were found to be globally accepted and appreciated. Global leaders set high ethical standards and act in accordance with them and influence ethical values of the organization through their behavior. They serve as role models, which everybody would like to follow for their followers and show them the behavioral boundaries set within an organization. The team perceive them to be honest, trustworthy, courageous, and expect them to demonstrate integrity. what do we all want? We want our leaders who care for their people and not just for themselves. We want our leaders to be kind, a kind of leadership to demonstrate, wherein which is based on fundamental principles of moral behavior and altruism. So there's a term called altruism, and I would like to take it further and then discuss about it. Altruism is the attitude of caring about others and doing acts that help them, although you do not get anything by doing those acts. So if we go by dictionary, this is the Cambridge Academic Content Dictionary says about altruism. So of late, it is realized that what we are looking for in our leaders is altruism. So a lot of emphasis in ethical and value-based leadership on this style of leadership. Altruism is highly regarded in all cultures as the epitome of sound moral principles, and not just in the organizations, among our faiths also. I believe that all of us would agree that all faiths, no matter which religion, which faith do we follow, our texts also talk about caring about others first, putting others first. And we also in our life like people who are putting others' opinions, considering others' opinion and putting others' choices first. So if that sort of those sort of qualities are adopted by leaders in their leadership style, they are actually really appreciated these days. Our professional practice should also be a direct extension of our ethical code and personal values. So with this, I'll hand it over to Andrew to take it forward. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Juhi. So there were in the UK in the 1990s a few particular political challenges around integrity. There was a big scandal called the Cash for Questions scandal, where MPs were accused of taking bribes to ask questions in Parliament and a few things like that. And as a result, the government got together with a few other world governments and got together with a few other bodies and said, look, we need to write some principles that can be pretty much universally agreed and adopted as a set of principles for how public office should be maintained. So these are called in the UK the Nolan principles. They're not limited to the UK, although that's where they have their origins there. And they are values that I think most of us in any leadership position would think are actually quite a useful starting point for anybody involved in public life. So those are the principles there: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. And basically, in terms of selflessness, the principle states, like, people in public office, people in leadership of any kind should take decisions in terms of the public interest. There are temptations in any leadership position that we find ourselves in to think, well, how can I gain from this? But that's not leading with integrity. That's not leading ethically. We shouldn't seek to gain financial or other material benefits for ourselves, but also for our family and friends. That's what selflessness means. Integrity means we shouldn't place ourselves under any financial or other obligation to outside individuals or organizations that might influence us in the performance of official duties. So my wife and I like watching American crime shows, American TV, and we're watching one at the moment called Chicago PD. I don't know if you have that in India. I don't know if any of you have seen that, but one of the big storylines at the moment is about police corruption in Chicago, and it's a really exciting storyline, but it never works out well, I found out from this TV show, if you put yourself under the influence of another person or another body. If you owe something to them or have a commitment to them or some kind of obligation to them, it always turns out bad in the end. Integrity is absolutely crucial for all kinds of leaders. Objectivity, so decisions need to be made on the basis of merit and not for subjective reasons. There are always people that we like working with more than others. There are always people we connect to better than others, but we shouldn't make our decisions on that basis. They need to be objective, and they need to be accountable decisions as well. I'll say a little bit more about this shortly, but we need as leaders to be prepared to submit ourselves to external scrutiny sometimes, and to say to the public, look, this is why we made this decision. This is the rationale behind it. We shouldn't be frightened of holding ourselves accountable. Openness as well is really crucial, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Now, of course, we shouldn't kind of feel that we need to tell everybody everything. There are some leadership issues that are private and need to be kept private. But at the same time, when we can be transparent, we should be, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Honesty, so the willingness to declare any private competing interests, or determination to take steps to resolve conflicts in ways to protect the public interest. And finally, leadership. Anybody in public office should promote and support those principles by the way they go about leading. They should be excellent examples. And these are to do with behaviors and cultures. They're not to do with processes. They work on the ethical assumption that if a person practices good values and lives by good values, that will result in good outcomes. And that's not a bad way to approach value-based leadership, I think, starting with the assumption that if we cherish values, and the kinds of values that we're going to talk about throughout the rest of this session as well, if we put those values first and determine to live by them, then it will make us virtuous people. We'll make virtuous decisions, and those virtuous decisions are actually really good for our organizations and our companies and our universities and our political life as well. Making good decisions is a lot easier if you are driven by good motives in making those decisions. So let's talk a little bit about leadership, transparency, and accountability. Now, transparency isn't always a universally good thing. There are some things that we should keep private. If somebody shares some personal details with us, they need to be confident that those personal details stay with us and don't get shared all around the office, don't they? But there are some things that we do need to be transparent and open about. We do need to be accountable for our leadership decisions and to be able to talk about our motivation. If somebody comes to us and says, I don't understand why this decision was made, can you explain this to me? Can you talk me through why this should happen? That's not something to fear or to be frightened of. It's something we should embrace and welcome, because actually that ethical scrutiny is good for us and good for our organizations. And I think especially in the sphere of finance, it's really important that we go above and beyond to be transparent in that area there. We need to think about financial transparency and financial accountability. In terms of vision, in terms of the sense of direction of our organization, especially at the most senior leadership level, the vision of our organization needs to be clear, and we need to do all we can to follow it. I usually say to the leaders who are working with me, you shouldn't expect to find something coming out of nowhere from me. The kind of new developments that we pursue should make sense because they connect to and fit in with the strategy that we've been talking about pursuing for a while. And in terms of how we manage people as well, that's really crucial as well. People should be able to trust us. They can only trust us if we're open and honest with them. So transparency in our organizations should then lead to accountability in our leadership. Accountability and being open to being questioned is a good thing because it builds trust. Those who we are leading know they can rely on us. It inspires confidence because those that we are leading can trust us. They're happy to follow and support us. Even if they don't always understand, they might not have all the information, but they have the confidence to put their trust in us because they know that we, on the basis of the information we have, are going a particular way. Accountability also inspires ownership as well. It encourages the people who look to us for leadership to think, well, yeah, I'm a part of this as well. Our leaders are working hard, they're explaining what they're doing, they're supporting us, but I've got a role to play in this as well, and here's what I'm doing in that. It's good to have the members of our teams taking ownership as well. And actually, as they take ownership, that also improves performance. And there's lots of research data that talks to that, that if the people who are producing the product in your factory or whatever are kind of treated as just machines, they will perform far less well than if they're given respect, if they're given opportunities for growth and development. The more we can include them in the life of the company, the more we can value them, the better it is for them personally and for their growth. So how do we become more accountable then? How can we work on this and improve these things? There are benefits to that accountability. There's some research that talks about this, and in particular, research from an American academic in the business schools called Lacey Lowe. She's written an article which we can share with you on how to become more accountable. And this is her pattern basically for leaders who want to become more accountable. And she says, accountability has to start with honesty. And that often requires setting aside any personal pride. It means being prepared to admit your own mistakes. And that's not easy. As somebody who makes mistakes very regularly, it's quite difficult to put your hand up sometimes and say, yeah, that was my mistake. I went wrong. I have found, though, that actually it doesn't decrease people's respect for you if you say sorry. I think sometimes we think, oh, if I have to say sorry, that will highlight that I've made a mistake. People will lose respect for me. Actually, I found exactly the opposite. They will trust me more. They will listen to me more. They will respect me more if I'm happy to say, yeah, this was my mistake. I got it wrong. Let's try and fix it. So start with honesty. Don't be afraid to say sorry and to try and make amends and try and address the problem. Accountable leaders also are not people who avoid responsibility. They don't kick everything into the long grass and say, oh, well, that wasn't what I intended to do. It went wrong. It was somebody else's fault. And one of the things that's annoyed me so much about political leaders, especially in the US, if I can say that in this audience in recent time, is that complete failure to take responsibility. It's always somebody else's fault. It's always a mistake that somebody else made. What I did is always seen as being the right thing. And we need to be confident enough to say, no, this was my mistake, even if it was somebody below us on our team, even if it was somebody else in the hierarchy and it wasn't our direct fault, then we as the leader of that organization need to take responsibility for it and take responsibility for fixing it, not procrastinating. And I'm one of the world's best procrastinators. I can kind of delay things as much as anybody. I'm great at that if I'm not careful. But my commitment to being a value-based leader inspires me to want to avoid that and to want to learn how to improve and learn how to be a better leader. And that also involves avoiding under or over committing. Sometimes our enthusiasm carries us away and we say, oh, yes to everything because we're so excited about all these opportunities. It's very easy to do that. But over committing actually makes our life more difficult and makes us less likely to deliver on the things that we are really committed to doing. So don't under or overcommit. That's another kind of piece of learning from Lacey Lowe. Back to Juhi.
Yeah, so wonderful, Andrew. I think we can all relate to what you have said. So moving on to value-based leadership. So far, we have been discussing the ethical leadership, what are ethics, how are they important, what are the things that ethically approved behavior would do, a leader with ethically who would like to adhere to ethics would do. But now values, let's try to understand how our values, our belief system shape our leadership practices. So recently there have been, the perspective on leadership has been changing. Earlier, they were a fixed criteria into which the leader has to fit, but now the perspective is changing. The conscious approach, the conscious leadership is seeing the word differently, and here the leader is recontextualizing his or her place within it. It's a different approach of centering, wherein it is not centering within ourselves, but it is centering ourselves within the organization. So earlier, using your intuition, your biases, your beliefs into the organization was not considered to be good. But the new conscious leadership is grasping and appreciating the significance of the information that we are receiving, picking up the subconscious symbols as well as the explicit claims and assertions. So, this means being guided by your intuition over rational thinking in some circumstances. This also means moving away from an entirely profit oriented module. So, not only appreciating the economic value that people are bringing to the organization, but also appreciating their personal values. Now, in finding their personal value, they find their personal fulfillment, and that makes them more effective in the workplace overall. The value driven approach and the leaders, they does the inconvenient right thing. So that's very interesting. At times it's easy to do things which seems easy at the moment, but value driven leaders, for them, doing the right thing becomes the greater priority than having an easy life. They seek to do the right thing no matter what are the consequences. Of course, factoring in the consequences is an important element of whole process of deciding what is right, what is wrong. But history teaches us that organizations that try to protect their reputation and market position rather than confront failures head on always suffer from this approach. And Andrew is going to share an interesting story later, which would second this statement. So don't fall back on the easy way out. Have the courage to do the right thing simply because it is the right thing, even when it makes life harder. Value driven leaders take a stand on matters of principle and not policy, because establishing policy is important, but it is a work of management and not of leadership. Though very often leaders do need to manage, and there's a famous saying by John Cotter who said that. Who suggested that about 80% of the leadership job is effective management. But putting policies and procedures and code of practice in place, it is as important for a value-driven leader as establishing the principles. So matters of principles involve doing the right thing and not the procedural things. At times you have to think beyond the procedure and do the right thing. And this is why facilities in ethical thinking are essential for today's leaders. Value-driven leaders allow themselves to be accountable. And as Andrew has rightly said, that it is important for leaders to take decisions, but it goes hand in hand. At one hand, value-driven leaders must be actively accountable, particularly for their ethical standards and their decision-making practices. Perhaps not for their decisions, because it is a job for the leader to decide. However, the team should have, and the people under their influence and working with them should have freedom to question the decisions if they and to put forward their views on a particular issue. Because any decision, leadership decisions cannot be made in isolation from the rest of the team, and they need to arise of the corporate culture. Your team should question anything that comes out of left field at them. And there's no need to be threatened by questioning for leaders. In fact, it should be encouraged wherever possible and facilitated within a leadership team. There's a need sometimes to read against the grain of a decision you make yourself, let alone those others make. There has been changing perspectives on leadership, and therefore the new kind of approach, value-driven leadership has become more person-sensitive. When various sections of an organizations are pursuing their own priorities, it is only the sense of shared purpose and value that guarantees the unity of an organization. So value-driven leaders helps employees to build a deep personal commitment towards the organization, as they see that they're working for a purpose and they can identify with that sense of shared destiny. It ultimately improves their performance as well as their sense of well-being. Value-driven leadership is managing with people's best interest in mind, but yet, as a leader, you need to keep the corporate culture at heart. We need to take into account our team and team's interest and people that we serve more broadly, but we cannot afford to be driven purely by those needs. At Wiles, of course, we should always be guided by compassion. We cannot allow the values and culture of our organization to be compromised in any way, because ultimately it is the culture of the organization which makes it different from other organizations. But managing people at the same time is, again, a complex task that needs grace and wisdom. But sometimes people's person leaders are at risk of prioritizing their relationship with their own team over the delivery of organizational priorities. So therefore, to make a balance between keeping your people happy and considering their opinions, but at the same time, keeping the corporate culture at heart is very important. The next is accepting diversity of practice, which is very important component of value-driven leadership. So this is what Leonard Sweet has termed as harmonious difference. Sub-teams within an organization can have their own cultural flavors, but it is reasonably inevitable. But leaders need to be operating with dialectics of corporate language, because as I said, that your corporate culture is what differentiates you from the other cultures, other organizations. So culture is how that culture is outworked in practical running of the team should vary. So what needs to be, everybody needs to be treated with equity and not equality, which means the same level of flexibility and trust, but not always in the same areas. Value-driven leadership overall has a holistic perspective approach, which means that value-driven leaders encourage their colleagues to bring their whole selves to work, and which is the most important thing. As we were saying, we were trying to analyze how our belief system, our values, what we have learned throughout a life. Can you treat an individual in isolation other than her or his beliefs? So value-driven leadership appreciate the inseparability of life and faith. It says that you can't keep a person separate from the faith that he or she follows or the values that he or she believes in. And value-driven leadership encourage colleagues to draw on religious and spiritual insights in everyday decision-making. Now, Western intellectual tradition, as Andrew has rightly said, really struggle here. Now, we need to recognize that religion is important for many people across the planet. We need to question whether there are advantages for leaders and their collaborators in allowing space for spirituality in leadership and decision making. We need to question whether our organization helped or hindered by giving attention to religious values. So we need to take a moment and think on these questions, whether keeping your faith and values and carrying them to the workplace and using them when required, can that be helpful for an organization? So value-driven approach is a purposeful approach. And there are significant potential advantages to leaders and their collaborators in allowing space for spirituality in leadership and decision making. And there have been ample examples of that. One of many areas where India can help lead the way could be this. Many organizations would benefit from collapsing the historic Western distinction between the secular and the sacred components of life, which means keeping the public life secular and keeping your values and your beliefs to the personal life or the private life. And by adopting a more holistic and inclusive and conscious worldwide, more reflective of the global South. So a sense of purpose underpinning all the organization actions would be an important component of value-driven approach. It's a long-term approach. It's not about dealing with one issue at the moment, but then it sees beyond just one generation. Value-driven approach views current challenges as one step in an eternal journey. It builds resilience. It encourages reflective leadership. So we therefore need to encourage reflective leadership, responsive and steady leadership, as well as we need to promote an energetic and entrepreneurial spirit. To you, Andrew.
Thank you, Juhi. And that's one of the challenges, I think, for so many leaders today, in that the context in which we find ourselves leading, so speaking myself as a university leader, but also as a religious leader in some categories, and also as somebody in business life as well. So in those different spheres, I'm sometimes asked questions which have an immediate answer required. We've got to decide very quickly. The danger is that kind of quick decision making sometimes undermines the quality of that decision making. And so what we'd like to suggest to you is that we need to create a kind of model of leadership that's a bit slower. By that, I don't mean that it kind of defers decisions and keeps putting decisions off. No, there's no time for that. We need to keep moving. We need to keeping up with the movement of time and keep on top of the things that are going on in our world. But slow in the sense that it just like pauses for thought. It just reflects before rushing on to make the decisions sometimes. And so what I've sometimes called slow leadership, what we might call reflective leadership, is the best way, I think, of working out value-based leadership in individual decision-making processes. The US Space Shuttle Challenger, you may remember, I mean, you're all much younger than I am, but you may have talked about in history classes or something like that, that infamous day, January the 28th, 1986, where the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up before it left the Earth's atmosphere. I remember I was still at school in those days, and I remember watching it at school, really excited about another space shuttle launch, and then seeing the tragedy that occurred as the shuttle exploded and littered the Atlantic Ocean with its remnants. 7 astronauts lost their lives. What I didn't know as a 16-year-old at the time was that that disaster was the result of some very bad decision making. So NASA, the US Space Agency, and the engineers, a company called Morton Thiokol, were more interested in satisfying and entertaining the American people than making sure the launch and the crew were safe. At the time, America was losing interest in the space program. There was dwindling popularity for the space shuttle program. Lots of people were thinking, well, this is just taking up far too much money. And so NASA has spent a lot of time and money getting people really excited about this space shuttle launch. The last thing they wanted to do was to delay that launch. And this is a case that you may well have used yourselves in kind of those of you that teach in business schools, because it's a great example. It's a terrible example, but it's a great example of how groupthink and how bad decision making can result in disasters. What we've since found out is that the night before the launch, there was a team of 5 engineers at NASA and at the contractor Morton Thiokol that had tried to stop the launch because they were worried that there was data suggesting that if the temperature was cold, that the shuttle's booster rockets wouldn't seal properly, and that the rocket launch might be in danger. So on that particular day, the air temperature was 50 degrees Fahrenheit lower than for previous launches, and it happened that the temperature had caused the rubber seals to contract, and that's what caused the explosion. So there were meetings between the engineers and NASA. There were discussions. Look, we can't be sure this is safe. There's a danger that something might go badly wrong, but because of the need to keep moving forward, NASA decided to go ahead with the launch irrespective, and it resulted in that tragic disaster of nearly 40 years ago now. If only that leadership had been more reflective and more anchored in values, I think that disaster could have been avoided. And I think if they'd adopted a more reflective approach to leadership, then there are some challenges that they might have been better able to address. So let me give you some of the reasons that I think the team behind the Challenger launch went ahead with it anyway. And let me try and talk you through how a value-based approach to leadership would have helped in this space. So I think the first issue is simply one of schedule pressure. We are very often pushed to make very rapid decisions that people are just coming at us. I could never be a prime minister or a president. I'd just kind of, even from watching the TV shows, you can see them walking down the corridor and all their advisors follow them and they'll just ask them a very quick decision on a particular thing. Do we go ahead with this visit or not? Do we invest this money in this project or not? Just being asked to decide that as you're walking from one meeting to another would be awful for me. I couldn't do that. So I have respect for how they do manage it. But the pressure that our schedule imposes upon us is sometimes just too much. We're pushed to make rapid decisions. And sometimes we just need to pause for just a moment. I'm not saying for days or weeks or months, just a few seconds, even sometimes, just to think, hang on, let me just center myself. Let me get into this moment. Let me make sure that I am making this decision out of my values into a context in which I can speak authoritatively. We need to build what I've called a culture of engaged slowness. Sometimes a short delay means a slight loss of face, perhaps a potential slight loss of prestige. And when we value those things more highly than safety, then that's very problematic. When we are more concerned with our reputation than with making the right choice, that's not value-based leadership. And actually, the research data says that that actually harms the growth and the development of the organization. We live in a world of fast fashion, fast food, where everything is kind of very quick and everything is very responsive. But being responsive doesn't always just mean being speedy. And being speedy doesn't always mean you will win. I don't know if you know, there's a famous Greek fable. There was a famous Greek author in the I think a couple of hundred years BC called Aesop, and Aesop wrote a collection of fables or little stories. And I was saying to Shameen as we were starting, I'm useless at telling stories, so I'm not going to tell you the story. Go and look at the story of the hare and the tortoise. Basically, the hare sets out running, thinking, I'm going to win the race because I'm just so much quicker than the tortoise. It makes a mistake. And because it gets distracted and loses its focus, the tortoise ends up winning. And I think that story could be replicated many times over in corporate life, in the business world. First to market doesn't always mean the best to market. Apple, for instance, I'm a bit of an Apple fan. There isn't a market that Apple has been the first entrant into. They weren't the first computers. They weren't the first tablets. They weren't the first phones, but they tried to make sure that when they did enter the market, they did it better than anybody else could have done. Now, whether you think they achieved that or not is another matter, but that was certainly their aspiration. So I think a reflective or a slow leadership approach would help us attend to the quality of the outcome and not the speed of the decision. Sometimes just pausing, even in the midst of schedule pressure, even just for a split second, so that you're not just kind of allowing the answer to just roll off your tongue. It's a thoughtful answer that you've considered and you've thought through the implications of. That's the first one. The second challenge that I think the NASA engineers fell down on is the issue of inattention to detail. And not all of us are detail people. I'm not a detail person. I'm very much a big picture person by instinct. It's the details that sometimes let me down. And that's one reason why in my work collaborations, I need to work with people who are on top of the details. I need to create a culture that people who are detail experts can sit alongside me and can say, Andrew, your ambition is all well and good, but have you thought about this? Or how are we going to deliver this? It needs to be so much more than just a dream. There needs to be a concrete strategy to help the dream be implemented. And I think we need to learn to see the beauty in the detail sometimes, and to realize that actually, for all the big dreams and aspirations, we will never get there if we don't focus on those smaller details and on delivering those. Those managers at NASA 40 years ago didn't, it seems, care about the minute details. They weren't worried about the technicalities. They just said, well, it's been all right so far. There's no reason to think that it won't be all right this time. And of course, that resulted in disaster. So value-based leadership, reflective leadership, focuses on details as well as the bigger picture. It doesn't mean that every single leader needs to be on top of every single piece of detail. That's just not realistic, sadly. But it means we need to make sure we're surrounded by people who are detail experts, who can speak authoritatively into those situations. The next challenge, I think, and these next three are all quite closely related in some way, but the next challenge that I think the NASA engineers didn't navigate well, and that's the challenge of cohesion to the point of exclusion. Cohesion to the point of exclusion. What do I mean by that? I mean getting lots of people who are the same into the room. And of course, like, ultimately, we're all the same. We're all human beings. We all share the same values and aspirations, kind of thing. But we all equally know that there are things that are more or less important to us. There are priorities that motivate us, ambitions that drive us, perspectives that inform our thinking. It's really important that we break beyond the boundaries of our little clique, our little group, and draw in voices from other contexts as well, who can speak authoritatively into their context and give us new insight and new wisdom, right? Just having a group of people who think like you harms the organization. Again, many of you are much more expert on this than I am, but you've probably seen the research data that suggests the simple fact of adding a woman to the board of a major global corporation has a 10 to 15% impact on its bottom line, okay? Just the fact that all of a sudden there is a different perspective, there is a female perspective at the most senior level, broadens the company's understanding and its potential to kind of reach out into broader markets. And actually the research suggests that it's exponential as well. So if it's just one woman, it's around about 10%. If it's two women, then it can be as much as 30%. So maximizing that value, because the one woman on the board doesn't think, oh, I'm just here to be the single woman on here. I'm just here to represent all women. But there's a culture of listening to different perspectives and listening to different voices. So, of course, we need to share the same aspirations and goals. We don't want the company or the organization to be pulling in lots of different directions, but we need to make sure that the people who are leading our organizations don't always come from the same perspective. It's a good thing to have discussions at senior management level about, why are we doing this? Have we thought of this issue? Have we thought of this challenge? Scrutiny and careful questioning of decision making isn't a bad thing. It doesn't have to be awkward. Okay. And that leads us on to the next two things that I want to say, really, because these two almost form a triangle. They're almost different components of the same issue, really. So that's that illusion of unanimity. Is the fourth thing, the illusion of unanimity. In other words, this idea that we all think the same, this assumption that we all think the same. Sometimes the way that the rhetoric of board meetings is conducted can imply that we are all agreed on this, and it's very difficult to push back on it. If the managing director in a company says, oh, so we don't need to do anything on this particular issue because I'm sure we're all agreed that this particular division is doing really well anyway, right? If a senior male figure at the head of the company says that, it's very difficult for anybody else around that table to say, well, sorry, sir, but I don't agree. It's pretty much impossible for the young woman heading that division to be able to put her hand up and say, here's a bit of information you need to be aware of. It does indeed need courage to disagree. And in both the UK and India, culture makes it difficult to question those who are in authority. And it's down to the people who are in authority to change that, right? The junior person can't very easily say to the senior person, oh, you need to start being open to being questioned, right? The senior person needs to say, hang on, I'm going to take the initiative. It's not undermining, it's not disrespectful, it's not critical, but it's actually creating a better platform for better leadership and helping things move forward more positively. Okay, so that critical perspective is really important. I've been on boards of organizations where my role has specifically been to what I call read against the grain of a decision. And before the decision is locked down, before it's implemented, just to say, right, okay, let's just think about this one last time. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. I'm not saying like put it off till the next board meeting or anything. We need to decide quickly, but we need to decide carefully. So let's just think through the evidence for the argument for doing this job this particular way. We've talked through that, but let's argue against those arguments. Let's kind of see things the other way. We've said, oh, this particular division has to be closed down because it's not profitable. But let's argue against that decision. So our competitors down the road, well, their kind of pharmaceuticals division seems to be doing really, really well. So what are they doing right that we're apparently not doing, for instance? Just let's think through these kind of narratives. Let's question, let's bring a critical perspective, but constructively. The last thing anybody wants in a committee meeting is somebody who kind of is just so awkward and so kind of there's a beautiful British English word which I love called obstreperous. Obstreperous means kind of awkward, antagonistic, hostile, just kind of getting in the way and just making life difficult for everybody. The last thing you want on a board is obstreperous people, okay? But what we do want is people who are united in purpose, who have a cohesive goal, who have a shared ambition, a shared vision, a shared set of values, who are open to being accountable to one another, who are willing to question one another for the good of those individuals and for the good of the organization. Because it's only then that we'll begin to confront those illusions of invulnerability, right? I wish I was a superhero. I wish I could kind of change situations by just kind of stretching out my hand and kind of making my eyes glow or putting on my cape or something like that. We all wish we were superheroes, I'm sure. But we're not. With vulnerable human beings, and our organizations are equally vulnerable sometimes. So to get us to the final point here, really, then, and to bring all of this into some kind of conclusion, what can we do about this? I've said that a reflective or a value-based approach can be really helpful in this way. How can we implement it? How can we work this out? Well, so this is our suggestion to you, and we'd be very grateful for any comments that you have in the discussion time as well. The little model that we've put together has these 5 stages: pause, focus, listen, reflect, and act. Pause, focus, listen, reflect, and act. So again, as I've said repeatedly, not kind of saying let's defer these decisions for many years, just kind of stop and think, even for a split second sometimes. The conscious act of pausing rather than rushing on ahead is always a good one, okay? I've never had the privilege of driving in India, but driving in the UK is bad enough for me. And driving in the United Arab Emirates, I did a bit of this year and at the end of last year, and it's a very interesting experience to drive there, to be sure. But at stop signs, we in the UK and I presume in India as well, we have like give way signs, which mean that you kind of just pause at them for a second, and as long as you can see it's all good, you can carry on. And they have stop signs where at a stop sign you have to literally stop and then you can start again. Okay. And actually, I think sometimes we need to put those stop signs up in our organizational life just before we implement the decision. Okay, we think this is the right thing to do. Let's one final check, just pause. Let's actually physically stop, split second. Let's focus our attention on this particular issue. This is what we're deciding to do. Is this really what we think we want to do? Is this really going to bring us the outcomes we think it is? Has everybody bought into this decision? Does everybody agree with it? And sometimes, especially on a controversial decision, it's worth actually going around the table and saying, well, hang on, is everybody on the same page as this? There have been decisions that I've been involved in where I've wanted every single person to say, yes, I agree to this. It's not fair to kind of make a decision as a majority and then kind of that person to go out of the room and say, well, everybody else wanted this, but I didn't. That is a complete lack of ethics in leadership. All right. Leadership decisions need to be taken in the context that they are taken. And just to like pause for a second and just divert for a split second, I think it's really important when you're consulting people about decisions for them to be clear, are they being consulted or do they have a formal say in this? If you give the impression that they've got a vote, if you like, and then you choose to go another way, that can be really distressing. It can really upset and harm relationships sometimes. So I think it's really important to be clear. Look, I'll make the decision. I'm asking for your advice. I'll listen to that advice. Having listened to that, I'll choose how we act. And I think even just communicating that clearly sometimes to people makes a big difference to them. So pause, focus, listen, make sure you're taking in all the evidence, all the data, all the responses, reflect on that. And all of this can happen in a second or so in your head. But only then act. And as Shameen says, I think kind of many people act first and then kind of live to regret it later. I think a value-based approach to leadership, a reflective approach to leadership can really help us in this way. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to hand back to Dr. Shameen and we will have questions. That's my email and Juhi's email and the link to the website. We would love to hear from you later. If you've got any thoughts or observations or questions, do get in touch with us. But yeah, hopefully we've got time for some questions and for your ideas now as well. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you, Dr. Shameen.
Thank you so much, Professor Andrew and Dr. Juhi. It was really, really very amazing. I mean, we were feeling like it should never stop. I mean, you gave us so many learnings in just a short span of time. And as we discussed at the starting of the session itself, there are questions for both of you in the chat box, if you can say, and for others also, please use the chat box. We have 15 minutes for the same. And meanwhile, let's open the cameras for a group photo as like it would be a memorable event. All of us are joined here together with Professor Andrew and Dr. Juhi. And we have one of our resource person, Dr. Naila Ejaz. She has also been for this session along with us. So thank you so much, Dr. Naila, for joining. Everyone, please switch on the camera so that we can have a group photo. Would like to see a smile on everyone's face. Please smile for a photo.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Juhi, for your contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You joined us
It was an honor.
and delivered a very nice lecture.
We already have questions in the chat box, so it would be a great if we
Right. So we would like to take the first question from Dr. Dheeraj, and such an interesting question. And thank you so much for such insightful questions, because we would love to have a discussion on this, and there are some interesting questions we would like to answer and discuss it further. So the first question that he asked is, Dr. Dheeraj has asked what are the challenges of ethical leadership and how to improve ethical leadership. So Andrew, can I start, and we can maybe take it forward from there, from this question? So we would like to explain it. So as we have discussed that the challenge, we understand what is ethical leadership, wherein you do what you promise to do. The leader would make sure that everybody is taken care of. So, but at the same time, he or she is a leader. He would have to lead, make decisions in the best interest of the organization. So as we have during our presentation, we have said that making a balance between these two, taking care of your people, keeping those values and ethics on the forefront, and at the same time making profits for the organization that you're serving. So making a balance between the two is probably the most difficult challenge that ethics driven leader would face. I would like to explain it with an example, and we always, Andrew and me always believe in giving examples to make it more convincing for our audience. So I read a story wherein in an exam for the IIMs here in India, a student was given a scenario in which he was asked to decide as a leader, and this decision would decide his entry into the institute. So the question was that you are the CEO of a company, and this company is not making profits. So you are almost deciding to shut down the organization. However, shutting down the organization would impact badly on the employees because you have to fire them all. So now at this stage, or maybe some employees, you have to fire them because your company is not making profits. Now here comes an offer wherein you are told that if you give X number of money to somebody in some government, this thing, let's say, so the company's interest would be taken care of, and this is the only way, by giving bribe to some person, that you can save your company. And therefore, if your company is saved, the employment of the employees of the company would also be saved. So now there's a choice wherein you would have to either take a decision where a lot of people would might lose their job, or you would have to take a decision where the ethics and the organizational culture has to be compromised. So now you are in this position. Let us all think, what would we do as the head of the organization? Would we go ahead, give little money to somebody which can save our company and therefore end up saving jobs for a lot of people working with us? Or would we adhere to our values and our ethics and decide not to go for an unethical work and therefore compromise with their jobs? So now this, and the winning answer to this question was that the student said that I would not go ahead and give bribe for saving my company, because giving money would ultimately at some stage influence the organizational culture and the reputation of the company, which is the core of the company's vision and mission and values. And he said that if I do it at this point, I can maybe save their job, but at a later this thing, even when this is not revealed, this would stay with me, with us as an organization, which would not be healthy for the organization culture. However, to save the employment of the employees of the company, I would either offer them, to retain in the company at a lesser salary or whatever that I can afford to, or I can help them get placed in different other organizations with my recommendation letters and those sort of things. So this was a winning answer to this question. So therefore, the challenge for an ethical leadership is to make a balance between keeping your employees happy or adhering to the values of the organization. And as we have always said that altruism, wherein you're putting your employees' interests first, even when there is no benefit for you directly. So keeping that in mind. And the second part of the question was how to improve ethical leadership. So as Andrew has rightly said, diversity, we should start with having a diverse team so that to have everybody's perspective. And since I've been teaching women's studies, 13 years of teaching women's studies, it's in me, to talk about how gender diversity is important and how different genders, not just women, all the genders, having everybody on the board can bring diverse perspectives. So to start, the start of an ethical leadership style or a value-driven leadership style would be to have a team which is diverse, and not just at the entry level, even in the board. You need to have people on the board which have different opinions, which have different conditioning, which have different lived experiences. And it is not something that you're doing for them. This is what you're doing for the organization, because ultimately having people and different perspectives in the board would benefit to gain profits for the organization. So to have a diverse team is the step one. For me, the step two would be to have an environment where everybody not just is there, but is also have the liberty, and you build that courage. Somebody said that it needs a lot of courage to have a difference of opinion. So you as a leader need to create an environment where people do not fear to come forward and say that they do not agree to what you're saying. So to have difference of opinion, having different perspectives expressed would make your decision a holistic experience, a holistic decision, which would ultimately profit the organization. So then having the courage to question is difficult, but having the courage to accept difference of opinion as a leader is even more difficult. So you need to create a culture where people can come and question your decisions and suggest you that there can be other ways of doing it. And who knows, maybe their perspectives would bring more value to the decision being made. So I guess these kind of things would make organization culture more ethics-based, value-based, and that will be helpful. Andrew, would you like to answer the next question, which says that how do we implement, Dr. Neha has asked that how can we implement value-driven leadership? And Insha has asked that why is it important, how much leadership is important for the organization to grow? So would you like to answer that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and take those questions. Yeah. So let's start with the role of leadership in organizational growth. I think leaders sometimes overestimate their importance, and I'm certainly guilty of that. I think sometimes they assume that all the credit for whatever's happened belongs to them, and it certainly doesn't, because like the teams that we lead have as much influence, and even in the very large organizations, the teams on the ground actually have more influence in shaping the organization than the most senior leaders they do. If you think of a big global corporation, then the CEO might be well known from being at kind of public events and parties and might get in the press or whatever, and people know about them from there, but they know about the company from the experiences they have of engaging with that company. So if they go and buy from Walmart or whatever, or if they purchase something off eBay, it's the people they come into contact with, it's the experience of the user interface that really shapes their thinking more than the organizational leader. However, I think the thing that makes more difference than anything in an organization is its culture. The single biggest distinctive factor and the kind of barrier to success and the kind of facilitator of success is very much organizational culture, really. And I think it's the single biggest job of leaders. This is me channeling John Cotter again, really. The single biggest task of leadership is to create cultures and to create that atmosphere within our organizations that can result in thriving. So what do we as academics want from our vice chancellors, from our heads of department? We want them to help create atmospheres that kind of realize we need to prioritize teaching and research, that kind of encourage us to be creative and innovative in all our ways, that kind of support us, that are friendly, that are supportive, but don't allow us to kind of be complacent and to settle. What do we want from our country's leadership? How can they kind of shape our national culture? Same with other big organizations. It's the culture aspect of leadership that, to me, is the single biggest most important thing. And that really helps me answer Dr. Neha's question, because you can, I believe, create a culture in which value-driven leadership is cherished and promoted. It's possible to make an environment where people go back to draw on their values. And we talked about faith a little bit. I in the UK context, find that religion in particular is sometimes sidelined and people aren't keen on talking about this. And I'm not sure, and I'm not saying that kind of everything needs to be anchored in religion. But what I am saying is that there are sometimes really powerful motivations, such as religion, such as an ideology. And those ideologies can include things like vegetarianism as well, or political ideologies, feminism as well. Okay, those ideologies that are fundamentally important to us shape our actions and our attitudes and our responses, and creating rooms for constructive ideologies to be embedded within our organization's culture is really important. So there's some really interesting work you probably know as well as I do around how leaders build organizational culture. I'm really a fan of Edgar Schein's work on that. And he basically says one way you can create culture is just by doing stuff, simply. So he says, for instance, if you just institute events or experiences and reward people who kind of demonstrate those values, those things can be good ways of embedding those values. So there used to be a kind of standard joke format, and again, don't worry, I'm not going to attempt to tell jokes, I'm dreadful at it, but there used to be a standard joke format in British culture, where they were called Englishmen, Scotchmen, and Irishmen jokes, right? You perhaps have the equivalent in India, where first of all, the Englishman would come and do something and it would all go smoothly. Then the Scotsman would come and do something that will go smoothly. And then the Irishman would come along. And because the Irish are a bit stupid, kind of, and not very clever, the Irishman would get it all wrong and it would all mess up and be a total disaster. That was the kind of the format of the joke, and that's why these kind of jokes aren't popular today, because they were kind of dreadfully racist. But they are quite helpful in just showing that actually to embed a pattern, you only need to do it 3 times. Like in these jokes, you see somebody does something, somebody else does the same thing. The 3rd time it gets done, that pattern of behavior gets established. So by the time you get to the 3rd time, this is the way we do things. And the joke, such as it was, came from somebody not understanding the pattern. So consistently doing something, consistently rewarding people for behavior is a good thing. If somebody, even a senior manager who is junior to you, speaks down to one of your junior staff or is rude to them, I would actually correct them. I'd do it graciously for the first time. The second time, I would be a bit kind of harsher in it, a bit more kind of critical, because what you don't want is for that culture of it's all right to treat junior staff as if they're very insignificant and they don't, and we don't care about them. We can't allow that culture to be embedded and to be rewarded. So sometimes it's right to criticize, and that leads into the other question that I kind of can see down there from Dr. Shameen, if a student gets an unethical leader in their first job itself, what should they do? So maybe we can both have a go at this one, Juhi. And I would say it's not easy for them at all, but the first thing they need to do is resist the temptation to comply with that unethical approach to leadership. Okay, don't kind of buy into the culture of this is how we do it. It depends what kind of ethics we're talking. If we're talking about bribery, for instance, if we're talking about criminal activity, yeah, absolutely, have nothing to do with that. And I know it's not very straightforward, but if I found myself in a company that was relying on unethical and potentially illegal practices, I'd want to try and get out of that as quickly as I possibly could. But certainly I'd go out of my way to resist those things. If we're talking about something that's not like criminal behavior, but that's just obnoxious behavior or is unethical behavior, things like I can't think of a good example, but slightly lower level things that aren't criminal, then again, I would say to them, try not to get caught up into that culture, but you can actually, even as a junior member of staff, play a really significant role in creating an alternative culture. That it might be that the boss does this, it might be that the boss kind of treats us this way, but I'm not going to succumb to that. I'm going to kind of show my integrity and show that I'm a person who is kind of conducting myself ethically by the way I behave. So yeah, that's not a very good answer, and Juhi perhaps has something
That's a
better to
wonderful
add to
answer
that.
But to add to that, here comes the concern for our students to choose their organization carefully. So we are often tempted at the time of placements, we are often tempted to go for organizations which are offering, we only look at the economic aspect of it, organizations which are offering more money, we go for that. However, given a choice, if there are organizations, look for the organization's history. How has it been performing? Do they have an organization? Discuss it with others who are working there, maybe, or discuss it, go through the articles written on the organizational culture of the organization before you really go and join that, because nobody can work in isolation. And the manager, if you've got a manager who's not, who you think is not working ethically, so this reflects the culture of the organization that we have been discussing so far. It reflects that the organizational culture is all right with that sort of a behavior, and therefore to retain in that organization for a longer time would be difficult. So here comes the importance of choosing the organization at the first stage itself carefully, where the culture is conducive to the people working within them. The other question would be, our students, when they get into the first job, they often find, and no matter what job are you in, the first job is always difficult. The first job as teachers, the first job as homemakers, the first job, any first job is difficult. And your manager, you often end up finding your manager difficult to work with. Your immediate boss in the departments also, we find it often difficult to work with people. And therefore, we were discussing how complex it is to manage people to work with, not just for the managers, even for the team to work with new managers or the existing managers is so difficult. So people management, there can be many possibilities. One, because you are new in the organization and you think that the boss is not empathetic with you, and we have discussed that he has to make a balance between the priorities of the team and the organization culture. He has to give profits to the organization, and therefore, maybe for an example, if you ask for a leave and he says that to other people, and he says no, you can't get a leave at the moment, and you think this is not being being careful about, being caring about, and being warm about and concerned about your team. But the manager knows that 3 people are already on leave and he has to deliver this project, and therefore to cancel your leave at the moment is more important. For others to get a leave is probably more important than you, and he's canceling or she's canceling your leave. So you need to put yourself in the manager's shoe and see how he's struggling to make a balance between the team's priorities and the organization culture and the organization's goals. So that is there. The other thing could be you as a new recruitee, you can't probably, as Andrew has rightly said, you don't have to follow that culture. If you don't agree to that, and if you think that there's something really wrong in terms of ethics and values, you don't have to adhere to that. However, as a new recruitee, you can't go back and tell your boss that, boss, what you're doing is not right, the ways of doing it. You need to create, this is what we said, that you need to create an atmosphere among your team members wherein you can express your opinion among your peers. And from there, gradually the culture would start creating, which is ethically right. And eventually that by word of mouth, that thing would reach to the boss where you want it to reach. So not that, you're joined today, go to the boss directly in the cabin and say, boss, what you have said is wrong, what you're doing is wrong. You need to create that culture. It takes time. It takes time for that faith to be built in you. I mean, like in the organization, about your opinion, the faith would be built. You need to prove it with your actions and by staying there. So yeah, that's a very interesting question. And these kind of challenges keep coming when you want to adhere to the right path. So we need to be ready to deal with that. And as academics also, many a times we would like to be more friendly with our students, but at times we have students which would take advantage of that, wherein on the other hand there are students who would probably need more of our time and more of our understanding. So again, making a balance between the two would be probably the right thing to do. Thank you. Do we have more questions, Shameen?
No, I don't think so. The
So,
chat box,
Shameen,
yes, ma'am?
no, it's 5 o'clock.
Yes, we have 5 more minutes. We
And
should,
next-
our next session, I'll share you the details right away. But before that, I would like to thank a lot, Professor Andrew and Dr. Juhi. Actually, I'm short of words to thank you for this amazing session. Please accept this digital memento from our side as a token of remembrance. This is there for your efforts. We learned a lot from you. And we'll be glad to see you again. Please do join us in our upcoming sessions.